When we analyze the economy, we cannot analyze it without putting aggregate demand and aggregate supply together. So from this point onward, when we talk about what happens to the price level in the economy, what happens to the to the output of the economy, we mean the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium real output. So what does that mean? So now let's put together the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay? So when these two curves cross, the intersection between the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve gives us the equilibrium. In macroeconomics, we call this the macroeconomic equilibrium or macro equilibrium. The corresponding price level is the equilibrium price level, and the corresponding real output is the equilibrium real output. So at this point here, the real output demanded is the same as the real output supply. What that means is those people who want to buy goods and services, who are willing and able to buy goods and services at this price level, they will be able to get the amount they want to buy. Sellers who are willing and able to sell at this price level are able to sell the amount of goods and services they want. In other words, the market clears at this point. Everybody is kind of happy. So this is fairly stable until the next shock comes. So once again, from this point onwards, unless you are otherwise told, when we talk about the price level or the real output of an economy, we mean the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium quantity of real output, equilibrium of real output. So let's play with it a little bit. So here is an increase in aggregate demand. So we don't know how it happens, but let's say we are told that there has been an increase in aggregate demand. So previously we learned that an increase in aggregate demand is illustrated by a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curves. So here is our initial aggregate demand curve. So this is our initial equilibrium, P1, Y1, okay? And then when we have an increase in aggregate demand, we have a rightward shift. So we have a new aggregate demand curve now at AD2. You can see that we now have a new equilibrium, P2, Y2. So what happens here is that the price level goes up, the equilibrium real output increases as a result of an increase in aggregate demand. Next, let's look at a decrease in aggregate demand. Okay. So once again, we start out with AD1 and AS. Okay. This is our initial equilibrium, P1, Y1. After a decrease in aggregate demand, we now have a new aggregate demand curve, AD2, and you can look at the new equilibrium, P2, Y2. So what happens here is the price level comes down, and at the same time, the real output comes down. The equilibrium real output comes down. So that follows a decrease in aggregate demand. And then next, an increase in aggregate supply. So we are here initially. So with an increase in aggregate supply, a rightward shift of the aggregate supply curve, we now have a new aggregate supply. So this is our new equilibrium, P2, Y2. So when you look at how the equilibrium has changed, the price level has come down and the real output has gone up. So this is a result of an increase in aggregate supply. Next, a decrease in aggregate supply. So we are here initially, P1, Y1. Okay. Now we have a new aggregate supply curve with a decrease in aggregate supply. So here is a new equilibrium, P2, Y2. Okay. Right, so with a decrease in aggregate supply, you can see that the price level goes up, the real output decreases. At this point, I do want to emphasize that this is a very important graphical tool in economics courses. It is very important that you practice at home how to draw and how to understand and how to read these graphs. So you want to be, it may look very straightforward when you see me doing it, but trust me, some of you are going to get confused when you have to draw it yourself. So practice makes perfect. So you want to spend some time at home trying to practice how to illustrate a change in either aggregate demand or aggregate supply and how that will affect the equilibrium, both the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium quantity. So far, we have just taken the change in aggregate demand and aggregate supply as given. We have not talked about why. Why has there been a decrease in aggregate demand? Why has there been an increase in aggregate supply? So now we are going to slowly introduce ourselves to factors that can bring to these changes. We're going to start with the aggregate supply side because the list is much shorter. Next week, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about factors that will affect the aggregate demand side. So let's start with the aggregate supply side. We call them supply shocks or determinants of aggregate supply. So these are factors that can lead to changes in the aggregate supply. The list can be much longer than what we have here, of course, but in this classroom, we are just going to focus on these four. The first one has something to do with a change in the amount of inputs. Inputs are also called factors of productions. What are inputs? Think about workers or labor. Think about capital goods, such as machinery, such as equipment, factory plants, office computers, and so on and so forth. Think about raw materials, metal, cotton, and so on and so forth. So inputs are resources that can be used to produce other goods. We have labor, we have capital, we have land, and then we have raw materials, and so on and so forth. By land, we do not just mean literally land. Of course, it includes land. But by land, we normally include more than land. It also includes natural resources, such as timber, coal, and so on and so forth. So how does a change in the amount of inputs affect the aggregate supply? So let's just consider the economy of a very small town. Assuming that there are no constraints in other resources, no constraints in the factory capacity, no constraints in the amount of raw materials they can use, and so on and so forth. So let's say all of a sudden there has been a surge in young population. Young people just keep moving into this small town. If that's the case, what do you think will happen to the aggregate supply of goods and services of this small town? It's likely to increase, right? Holding everything else constant, this is likely to lead to an increase in the amount of goods and services that are produced in this small town. So in other words, as the amount of input increases, we are likely to see an increase in aggregate supply. Next, a change in the price of inputs. Suppose we observe a very sharp drop in the price of raw materials worldwide. Holding everything else constant, what is likely to happen to the amount of goods and services that can be produced? It is likely to increase, right? As the price of raw materials drop sharply, the cost of productions also goes down sharply. Holding everything else constant, firms or producers are more willing and able to produce more goods and services. In other words, as the price of input comes down, we are likely to observe an increase in aggregate supply. Next, a change in the productivity of inputs. Productivity and productions, they are related, but they are not the same thing. So let's look at an example. We have two companies, Company A and Company B. So let's say Company A produces 1,000 units per day. So that's a production. That's the output. Company B, on the other hand, produces 500 units per day. So that's production. But then when we look closely, Company A hires 100 workers to produce these units. Company B hires 25 workers. So when you calculate the productivity, in Company A, each worker can produce 10 units. In Company B, each worker can produce 20 units. So Company B is much more productive than Company A, twice as much. The productivity in Company B is higher. So productivity, in other words, is more like a measure of efficiency, how good the inputs are. So a change in the productivity of inputs definitely can affect the aggregate supply. So as the productivity increases, I hope it is quite intuitive that aggregate supply will increase. Okay, so as each worker or each unit of input can produce more goods and services, obviously the amount of goods and services that can be produced will increase. Okay, so the productivity increases, aggregate supply increases. So next we're going to talk about the last one, a change in technology. A change in technology doesn't necessarily have to be some sophisticated technology. It doesn't have to be the rocket science. It can be as simple as changing the way that people do things. Okay? So take for example, okay, a couple of centuries ago, so 18th centuries, we had this great economist, Adam Smith, who also happened to be a great entrepreneur. So he visited a factory, a pin factory, pins, very boring things, stationary, pins. So he visited this factory. The production of this factory was not too high. What he observed in this factory was that every single worker comes into work every day. This worker is involved in pretty much every single component of the entire production process. So that means each worker comes in, he will pick the metal, he will cut the metal, he will melt the metal, mold it, package it into boxes. So what Adam Smith suggested to the owner is to have each worker work on only one or two components of the entire process. So if a worker is in charge of cutting the metal, he stands there and cut it all day long. If he's in charge of packaging, he will stand there and do that all day long. So the owner found out that after the change, the productivity of the factory soared. Okay, so we still have the same amount of workers. Okay, we still have them work the same hours. So what's happening here? Well, it's a change in technology. Today we take it for granted, but at that time, that was a very novel concept, specialization. So a change in technology, or rather an improvement in technology, is likely to improve productivity or lower the cost of productions, or both. Most of the time when we talk about a change in technology, we have in our mind a technological progress. But once in a while, we may have technological setback. For example, in the late 1990s, when we started to have this widespread use of internet, many employers complained about workers spending too much time surfing or chatting with their friends, okay, a messenger thing for the very first time, okay, and shopping online, trading stocks online, and so on and so forth. So it could be counterproductive if employees spending too much time in the office, surfing, gaming, and not working. So in that case, that would be a technological setback. But most of the time, we refer to technological changes as something good that can improve productivity or to lower the cost. So as technological progresses, if we have a technological advance that can improve productivity or lower the cost, we are likely to have an increase in aggregate supply.